Welcome to the iPad Podcast, a weekly podcast from Mac's Future.
Hey, welcome to the iPad Podcast. This is Lex at Mac's Future. Hey, and this is episode 114, and it's December, what is it? Wow, we're December 1st. And my apologies, I haven't done this in a while. I guess the last time we did this, the last episode was in like early November, so it's been almost a month. And, I've been busy, and it's kind of hard to do it on a weekly basis. But I'd like to keep this iPad podcast going, and I want to thank whoever's listening to this, and I appreciate it. I'm just doing this for the, fun of doing it, and it's not really a full-time job. It's just a hobby. So thanks for listening, and you can help out this podcast and keep it going by giving it a positive review in the Apple Store, in the iTunes Store, and going to YouTube. There's a video version of this. We just have screenshots and such. And so there's a lot of stuff to cover, including my experience with the iPad Mini and news regarding the iPad. So let's get to it. This is episode 114 of the iPad Podcast. It's no chit-chat and all iPad talk. So let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is an interesting article about the iPad in Forbes magazine by someone named Darcy Travoyas. And she has a very interesting article that came out on November 30th, 2012, entitled Apple, 8 Reasons Why the iPad Will Dominate the Tablet Category. And, it's interesting. I think I agree with a lot of the reasons. For example, she gives one reason: the iPad proved itself as an e-commerce channel this Black Friday. And if you don't know about this, like after Thanksgiving on Black Friday, she points out there were a number of articles that showed that the iPad was used to generate online sales. And she writes, the iPad generated more online sales during the past record-breaking Black Friday than any other mobile device. And these were, metrics that are done by, independent parties. And it says here that online shopping on Black Friday accounted for over $1 billion in sales, up 26%. And it goes on to say is that people prefer to shop now with tablets, rather than smartphones. And so it says here that the iPad accounted for the greatest percentage of online shopping, achieving almost 10% across all devices and 105% growth over the last year. And it even exceeded online shopping activity of iPhones, which had 8.7%, and Android devices, which only had 5.5% for online shopping. And, everyone's talking about how dominant Android smartphones, but they barely have made any sort of significant dent in online shopping. So that's a really interesting point. People are using it. It's not just a content consumption device. If you're purchasing and buying stuff through the iPad, that's a form of content creation. She also says the iPad is an effective channel to promote products and to convert visitors to customers. And it says here, according to Cisco, video accounts for over half of all internet traffic on mobile devices, and that video is effective in converting potential customers to buying customers. And it says here that a group called NPD estimated that more than 40% of iPad owners have income over $100,000 versus 26% of non-iPad tablet owners. In other words, they're wealthier than non-iPad tablet owners. And so basically the point of her article, she's like, people can watch a lot of videos and buy stuff, and so the iPad is a great place to do it for retailers because, first of all, they're a little wealthier, I guess, the people who use the iPad. Other points she makes, she says, tablets are the consumer electronic product of choice this holiday, and the iPad leads the list among those surveyed. And apparently there was an NPR survey of, done, and in the consumer product categories, the tablets stole the show, according to this survey, and it said that kids in general really want to get the iPad. It said Nielsen surveyed children 6 to 12 and teens, and the iPad remained the number one most desired gift this holiday season. So, that's another reason I guess she's giving why the iPad is going to do well. Here's another point she makes. The iPad is the tablet of choice in China. And, the iPad just recently started selling in China in July. And it said that in this past quarter, the iPad dominated the tablet market in China, taking 71.25% of the market. And in other words, 19% of all iPads sold were in China. And so China's a huge market, and it's basically she's pointing out that China's love of Apple stuff is going to fuel, the iPad's dominance. She goes on to say the iPad is also, another reason it's going to dominate is because it's really done well in adoption in the education market. And it says that here in the June quarter, when most of the educational buyers take place, iPad sales to schools doubled. It says here over 2,500 schools are using iPads. And, so she thinks that the iPad is strong in the education market. And then also another market she says the iPad is strong is in the enterprise market, pointing out statistics that, in 2 years, 94% of the Fortune 500 has deployed or are testing the iPad. And, she points out earlier this year at CSE, this SAP CIO discussed their rollout of iPads to 14,000 employees and the benefits. So her point is that the iPad deployment in the enterprise is similar to how quickly the enterprise adopted many years ago the Palm Pilots. So what else? She says the iPad has dominated the potential tablet market as the iPod still leads the MP3 market. And I think the point here is that the iPad is going to sort of dominate the tablet market, similar how the iPod continued to dominate the MP3 market even after it was out for a while. In other words, it continued to, hold massive shares. Another point she makes is that the iPad is profitable, that the gross margins of the iPad, including the iPad Mini, are high, 40 to 55%. And Apple's margins in the tablet space really surpass the margins, of its competitors like the Nexus 7 and the Fire. So, the point there is if you've got margins in your devices, you can take those profits and really support making them premium. So I kind of agree with her as to these reasons why the iPad will dominate. I will add my own reasons. I think what happens also is that when someone's the leader in a particular area, it has more apps and such, people become sort of used to it, and they don't want to go to the runner-up because it's more risky. So, for example, a lot of schools and enterprise situations, they're going to go to the iPad because it's the leader, and they're not going to get in trouble or second guessed if they go with the leader in the market as opposed to the number 2 or number 3. So if you're a big enterprise owner and you have to make a decision as an IT manager, hey, what do we get as tablets? And you get like the second or third place device, and it has problems, people are going to second guess you. But if you get the number 1 leader, if people second guess you, you say, well, that they're the dominant leader in the market. And that's pretty much what happened with Windows, right? Once it became dominant, its dominance continued because people in the enterprise or in schools who are making the purchasing decisions, they don't want to be second guessed, and it's hard to second guess someone buying the market leader. So I think that in itself is a big reason why the iPad's going to dominate. Another story really caught my eye. actually today on GigaOM. It's a great website run by Om Malik. It's actually, I think, also a tech consulting company of some sort. But he's got a great blog on Apple called the Apple Blog. And GigaOM's Om Malik, I guess, made an interesting observation. Well, and this is how it relates to the iPad, specifically the iPad Mini. Many of you may have heard of Tumblr. Tumblr is a web blogging site where it's easy to, have a blog going. And actually, maxfuture.com is on Tumblr. And I like Tumblr. It's easy to blog. There are blog posts. And the guy who started Tumblr started it when he was 18, David Karp, and he's like wildly successful. And he is now the chief executive officer of this company. It's a huge company. It has crazy amounts of page views. And Om Malik bumped into him at a tech conference and did a sort of interview with him, discussing various things. And he has a very interesting quote when asked about the iPad Mini. He says, "I am over." This is David Karp. He says, "I am over laptops and the posture that comes with them. I am coding a lot less, so I use my computers a lot less. I still want to simplify even further and just carry one device. So I want to try the iPad Mini with the cellular antenna as my only device and as a phone replacement, and use Skype and Google Voice instead." So this is really interesting. I mean, David Karp, I think, is pretty wealthy because I think they got all sorts of millions of dollars in funding at Tumblr. But the fact that he wants to use the iPad Mini in this way as an all-consuming device. And frankly, I've been saying this for a long time, that, why do we have even phones? Because if you have a cell data connection, you can make voice over IP calls using Skype, or if you use a third-party app with Google Voice, you can send and receive calls. And, Apple was never able, or has never released an iPod Touch, which is essentially like an iPhone with a cell data connection, because I think it would cannibalize the iPhone, and also probably the carriers don't like it. But when the iPad came out, Apple cajoled AT&T and then later Verizon to have cell data connection to those devices. And I guess the thinking was the iPad is so big, it will never really just replace a phone or a smartphone. But the iPad Mini is much smaller, and it is pretty mobile. Not as mobile as an iPod Touch, but certainly much more mobile than an iPad. And in fact, I can put it in like a coat pocket. I was able to put it into inner coat pockets and side pockets, and it is very feasible to just sort of have this one device be your smartphone and your tablet, and you would save a lot of money because you can get these data plans that are only like $30 a month, and the smartphone plan with the phone plan and the data plan is, I think, usually at least $80, with the regular carriers, AT&T and Verizon, and his point is, look, he doesn't do coding. He's sort of the business guy. Other people do the coding. And so he thinks he could use the iPad Mini as a consumption device. And this sort of endorsement from David Karp as to the utility of the iPad Mini, or the potential utility of the iPad Mini, is a pretty powerful endorsement. So we'll have to see if other people follow this. Now, one of the reasons that I think the iPad will continue to sort of dominate the tablet market is because I think some of the competition is fumbling. And one area of competition that Apple could have in the tablet market is from the Goliath, Microsoft. Microsoft entered into the tablet market this summer when it announced that it was coming up with something called the Surface. And it has the Surface RT, which runs on an ARM processor. And then also it was going to have a more powerful Surface tablet called the Surface Pro that is going to run Intel chips and is backward compatible with all the Windows programs. And that's, if Microsoft has any sort of way to do well in a tablet market is the fact that it dominates the traditional desktop or laptop computing market, and the Windows operating system continues to have the vast majority of market share on traditional computing devices like laptops and desktops. And Windows has a huge arsenal of apps and programs. And so one way for Microsoft to leverage that power is to have those apps and programs like Microsoft Word and Excel and other programs work on the Surface tablets. But on the Surface RT tablets, which is lighter and cheaper and more competitive with the iPad, because it runs an ARM processor, the programs don't automatically work on it that worked on Windows. But Microsoft said, hey, we're going to have this Surface Pro tablet that runs the Intel chip, which is the chip on all traditional Windows computers, and that will be backward compatible. Well, this past week, I guess on Thursday, Microsoft announced pricing, as MacRumors.com reported, on the Surface Pro tablets, and I think it really upset a lot of people. The prices are really high. For example, the tablet will cost $899 for the 64 gigabyte version, $999 for a 128 gigabyte version, and it's going to come with a 4 gigabytes of RAM, an i5 processor, and a resolution of 1920 by 1080. And of course, this makes the device heavier, and also the battery life isn't supposed to be very good. The battery life for the Surface Pro is supposed to be 4.5 hours compared to the 10-hour battery life of an iPad. And so people think this is, a disaster for Microsoft. In other words, if Microsoft was going to have a really competitive tablet, it was going to be the Surface Pro, because then people would buy it and know that they can run traditional Windows programs. So the price at almost $1,000 and the short battery life is going to make a lot of people wonder, why should they get this? Why shouldn't they just get a MacBook Air or something very light? So a lot of people, I guess, think that it's not going to do well, and that and some of the initial indications are that sales of Surface tablets are dismal and not doing very well. So we'll have to see, but to some extent, Microsoft's strategy of creating a Windows tablet that runs the same operating system as desktop and laptop computers may be a really bad move. And and part of the problem is why wouldn't people pay the same price or a higher price for a Surface tablet when they can get the market leader of the iPad and know that it just plain works? So I think Microsoft's tablet strategy is in disarray. Well, as I mentioned, good news for Chinese consumers. All Things Digital, All Things D, a Wall Street Journal publication, reported on November 30th that the iPhone 5 as well as the iPad Mini will be sold in China in December. And it says Apple has moved quickly to bring the iPhone 5 to China. On Friday morning, the company set a date to bring the latest iteration of the iPhone to the world's most populous country on December 4th. And I guess the iPad Mini is also going to be sold in December. So it's gotten regulatory approval, I guess, to sell both the iPhone 5 and the iPad Mini. And I have a feeling the Wi-Fi version of the iPad Mini will do very well in China. Now, it's been just short of a month that I've had these iPad Minis. I guess when I last did the podcast on November 2nd, I had just gotten these iPad Minis. I got two of them, a white one and a black one. The Wi-Fi version, 32 gigabytes. And so I've decided to keep them, and frankly, I've given one to each child, a boy and a girl. And I have a pink cover for the girl and a blue cover, smart cover for the boy. And so what are my thoughts and impressions on them? Well, I think they're great, and I think they're going to be a huge hit. In particular, the way my kids have taken to them, they like them so much better than the regular iPads, because the regular iPads are just heavier. And for kids, this is like an ideal size. Now, for adults, so for gaming, in particular for kids, it's just a tremendous gaming device. All these games like Temple Run, Angry Birds, all that stuff, it's just easier for a child to hold. Also, watching kids' videos and kids' programs that are, all that content on the iPad, it's just great for kids. Very easy to use. And it's just so light. I mean, it's, but for an adult, I do think there's going to be some situations where I think an adult is going to prefer the bigger iPad, particularly the Retina display, 4th generation, 3rd generation. So a friend of mine recently, who never had an iPad, wanted to get an iPad and got the iPad Mini, and he wanted to use it mainly for work, reviewing documents that were in PDF form. And, the one thing with the iPad minis are that the screen is not Retina. It's like the same dimensions as the 2nd generation iPad, which is still pretty good, but it's not as, great for reading PDFs as a full-blown Retina display 4th generation iPad or 3rd generation iPad. So if you're going to use it in an enterprise situation, really to review a lot of documents, you're going to want to go with the bigger screen and one that's also Retina. On the other hand, if you really care about mobility and you're not really using enterprise apps to read PDFs, but really maybe certain apps that are designed for the enterprise that are button driven or typing driven, and you're on the go and you want something light, you might prefer the iPad Mini. So, and I also do think there are going to be some people who are going to get both the full-blown iPad and the iPad Mini, and they might not get a computer at all. And instead, their base computer will be the full-blown iPad Mini, iPad, like the 4th generation. And when they want to be a little more mobile, they take the iPad Mini. So there might be people who just keep the full-blown iPad at their desk and do typing on it and do all their work, and when they want to go to a meeting or be more mobile, they take the iPad Mini with them. So I think the iPad Mini is a huge hit. People just love how light it is, how thin it is, and it's like having an iPad but in a thinner, lighter form, and it's that thinness and lightness what makes it incredible. Now, I was listening to Leo Laporte, and I guess on a Twit network, and I guess right before the iPad Mini came out, he was talking about how the Microsoft Surface tablet was going to really do well, and how he thought that was going to be the way to go, and it was going to be a better device than the iPad Mini. And he came back from his trip to, I guess, on a cruise, a MacMania cruise down in Australia and New Mexico, and I heard him tell, I think, Sarah Lane, that he was mistaken, that in fact the iPad Mini is the device that is great and not the Surface. So I guess my advice is this. If you're looking really for mobility, and I should say something else about the reading, which is PDFs don't read as well on the iPad Mini as on the Retina display iPad, but iBooks and eBooks read well because they're a different file format, and you can see the text pretty well, and you can adjust the text to pretty much a larger font on in the iBookstore. So for book reading, it's fine. I found Instapaper and some of these books that I bought, like the book on Steve Jobs and such, they're fine on the iPad Mini. In fact, I'm looking right now at Daniel Suarez's novel Freedom, and it's easy to read, and frankly, because it's so light and thin, it's sort of like the original Kindle in weight. It's easy to hold. It's easy to read. You feel like you can hold it with one hand for a significant amount of time, and your hand doesn't get strained. And with the regular size iPad, the 3rd generation or 4th generation, your hand will strain. So for book reading, I would suggest the iPad Mini. For work, reviewing documents in PDF form and typing and all of that, I would get the full-blown iPad, unless your work is such where you're mobile and you want to input stuff into your iPad Mini. So that's a little confusing, but that's sort of my impression so far after 1 month of having both the iPad Mini and the 3rd generation iPad in my life. Now, speaking of Retina display, what would Apple have to do to make the iPad Mini a Retina display device? And there was an interesting article in PC Magazine by David Murphy entitled Retina Display on the iPad Mini, What It Would Take, dated November 25th, 2012. And actually, he cites to an analysis done by the highly respected tech blog anandtech.com, which really just sort of analyzes all technology in a sort of very technical way. And AnandTech, in its review in terms of getting a Retina display, said, Apple has some challenges with that. And it's a very logical analysis in the iPad Mini review dated November 20th, 2012 by Anand Lai Shimpi, who's the head guy, and Vivek Gowri. And here's his analysis. There is 3 routes that Apple has to enable Retina display on the iPad Mini. The first thing that they could do is what they did with the iPad 3 and the iPad 4, which is quadruple the number of pixels. And you do that by doubling the vertical and the horizontal dimension. That's what Apple did when it went from the iPad 2 to the iPad 3. So if they did that, then the Mini's display would go from using 1024 x 768 resolution to having a 2048 x 1536 panel, which would be the same resolution as the iPad 3 or 4, but in a much smaller display. And it would result in the iPad Mini having a pixel density of 326 ppi, that's pixels per square inch, versus 263 for the iPad 3 and 4. So it would be highly, highly dense pixels on the iPad Mini. And they say that Apple could do this, but then it's going to need to do the same things that it did with the iPad Retina display. It's going to have to introduce a larger battery and make a larger SoC, I guess that's system on a chip, a processor to drive it. And they point out the bigger battery is needed because of the more powerful backlight, and the system on a chip is needed to render the UI and the games at such a high resolution. And this would really make the iPad Mini size and cost even greater, which would make it even less of a mini. Because really, I think the thinness and the lightness of the iPad Mini is what makes it really great. And, I will say, I remember last spring when I went from having the iPad 2nd generation to the iPad Retina display, the 3rd generation. When I got the 3rd generation iPad, I was a little miffed because it was thicker and heavier a little bit than the 2nd generation iPad. And the 2nd generation iPad had been thinner and lighter than the 1st generation. And I remember thinking at the time, was the trade-off for the Retina display worth it for the iPad? And to some degree, even now, I still kind of resent that the 3rd generation iPad and the 4th generation iPad is heavier than the 2nd generation iPad. And I want my Retina display, but I also want the thinness and lightness, because it's the thinness and lightness of the iPad that make it a great device as compared to a regular computer. On the other hand, the Retina display is very important. So anyways, their point is that how is Apple going to do that? Well, another option that AnandTech points out is that Apple could pick another resolution that's in between the current resolution and quadrupling the resolutions. And let's say a resolution of, let's say, 1600 by 1200, and you could maintain the same aspect ratio, but you just get greater pixel density. For them to do that, Apple would have to do some scaling and filtering to hit the new resolution, which could reduce quality, they say. And they point out that Apple does this on the MacBook Pro with Retina display to enable a higher resolution modes. And it says to maximize image quality, however, Apple renders the desktop off screen at 4 times the resolution, then scales down to fit the panel. And there are performance concerns regarding doing that. They also point out a third way to do this is to go to the root of the iPhone 5, which is to pick a new resolution and enable support for it. But then, AnandTech points out this will be a real problem for developers because you want to have your apps run across the different iOS devices. And the more you make the pixel count or the interface different for each device and not make it easy to scale up automatically, the harder you make it for developers. So, their conclusion is that they wouldn't have you hold your breath in terms of like waiting for the Retina display to to come to the iPad Mini. I don't think it's going to come in the next generation. I bet you by the third generation, particularly as Apple perfects battery technology and energy efficiency, Apple will find a way to and also screen technology. I mean, Apple, like other manufacturers, are doing all sorts of interesting stuff with better screens, and maybe somewhere down the line, Apple will figure out a way to create a better screen and pixel count for the iPad Mini without sacrificing battery life or thinness and heaviness or lightness. So it's an interesting trade-off, but I think Apple made the right one with the iPad Mini. So what is the future of, the iPad in terms of its processors and the stuff that goes in it, and one of the issues really is, Samsung's a big supplier and I guess puts together the processor that's, Apple designs, and Apple uses ARM design technology that it licensed from ARM Holdings, but Apple sort of makes its own A6X processor, which is really great. But who actually makes it for them? And Samsung does. Samsung has what's known as a foundry, which is basically you tell us how to make it, and then we stamp it out and make sure the quality's there. But Apple and Samsung obviously don't like each other because Samsung is copying Apple, and Apple and Samsung are suing each other crazy. And there was a really interesting rumor or story that CNET posted that's based on an analysis from a RBC Capital Markets, where an analyst, a stock analyst, came up with a report where he suggested that maybe Intel, which has been making the chips for Apple's Macintoshes and which has dominated the Windows platform, may in the future become a partner with Apple on developing processors for like the iPad. And it's an interesting analysis that CNET reports that this analyst Doug Friedman had, and it kind of makes sense, which is that maybe Apple can entice Intel to make as a foundry the ARM processors that go into the iPhone and the iPad, which Intel probably really doesn't like doing, but in exchange, maybe Apple will, say that some future more powerful iPad will have an Intel chip in it. Now look at, that. Why would Apple have different chips in the iPad and the iPhone? In other words, why would one be an ARM and one an Intel? On the other hand, look at it. Apple, if you look at the whole computing family, Apple has two types of computers, the iOS computers and the Macintosh computers. And they use different chips. The Intel chips are on the Macintosh computers, and these ARM-designed, Apple-designed iOS processors are on the iOS devices. But Apple wants to get away from Samsung, and Apple, in the long run, is going to want to have iPads that are really super powerful. Because really, if you think about it, the iPad is the future of computing, right? I mean, as the iPad becomes more and more powerful, it can do more and more things, and as things like tablet covers that have keyboards built into them get developed, it's going to replace things like the MacBook Air or the MacBook Pro Retina or even the iMac and stuff, because you can hook up an iPad to a monitor and it, shows everything there. So I do think at some point, if Intel is interested enough and Apple wants to get away from Samsung enough, and Apple might do a deal with Intel where Intel develops, powerful chips that work on tablets. The key is if Apple together with Intel can design chips that are powerful to drive, future Retina displays of the iPad, but not take up much battery life and not cause, much heat, and allow very thin, light tablets to be created. So I think it's very possible. Apple is so mad at Samsung. I could see it going, to Intel. I mean, it had somewhat of a rocky relationship with Intel. Apple wasn't happy with, I guess, the speed that Intel was developing chips for the Macintoshes. But on the other hand, Intel hasn't outright copied Apple, although on some things they have. So anyways, this is an interesting twist. When you're Apple's size, who are your friends and who are your enemies? And the problem is Apple feels like it got burnt by its friends, Google and Samsung, and so it might have to turn to other big tech companies like Intel to become partners with. So we'll have to see. Now, good news if you have one of the newer iOS devices like the 4th generation iPad, the iPad minis, or the iPhone 5, or the new iPod Touches. As you know, Apple switched away from the 30-pin dock connector with the launch of the iPhone 5 and the iPod Touches, and then the iPad mini and the iPad 4, to what's known as the Lightning cables. And at the beginning, only Apple had Lightning connectors, and they were kind of expensive. And Apple's closely controlling the licensing and the method of making these Lightning compatible devices. But Cult of Mac reported that one of the more reputable companies that has been out there making sort of iPhone or Apple related stuff, Griffin, has just released the official first Apple approved third-party Lightning cables, and they look pretty decent and not that bad a price. Now the thing is, if you buy from a non-authorized Lightning cable maker, the cable might not work because Apple has a proprietary chip in there that you need to use for it to work well. And so let's see, the shortest of Griffin's cables is $17, and that's a 2-foot Lightning cable. The 3-feet Lightning cable is only $2 more at $19, and the 4-feet cable is $25. And let's see, a 3-meter cable, if you really want a long one, is $30, and the 2-footer cable is coiled, which could be kind of handy. And Apple sells a 3.5-foot Lightning to USB cable for $20, and that's only white. Griffin's cables are black. So, the point is you're going to see more choice now, and it's nice that you have these choice with Griffin's cables. So check it out. Now, one thing that you might have done in the past, or you might be thinking of doing, is jailbreaking your iOS device. But as a Fortune article by Adrian Kingsley Hughes points out, you really can't jailbreak the iPad 4 or the iPad Mini. Now, what is jailbreaking? Jailbreaking is when you use some software to put an alternate store for apps on your device other than Apple's App Store. And then you can install apps that Apple hasn't approved on your device. And in the past, the jailbreak community has been successful at jailbreaking various iOS devices, starting with some of the earliest iPhones and going through to the iPad 2 and the iPad 3. Actually, I don't know about the iPad 3, but the second generation iPad was jailbroken. And right now, you're out of luck, according to this article. There is no jailbreak for the iPhone 5, the latest iPod Touches, or the iPad 4, or the iPad Mini. And the jailbreak community is working on creating a tethered jailbreak, but that's not too good because a tethered jailbreak, as opposed to an untethered jailbreak, requires you to reboot and jailbreak again when your device crashes or the battery goes flat. So you basically have to connect it to a computer and re-jailbreak it. It just doesn't restart when your device crashes. And an untethered jailbreak survives a reboot, and that's the best kind. But apparently there's nothing close to coming out like that. So, on the other hand, I'll tell you, Apple has incorporated a lot of stuff that in the past would make you want to jailbreak. For example, if you have an iPad Mini on Verizon or an iPad on Verizon, you can Wi-Fi turn it into a Wi-Fi hotspot for free. And now Apple is, doing 3G FaceTime over 3G data. So that's that's something that you can do now. So a lot of the reasons you'd want to jailbreak, like in screen recording, there are now apps that allow you to do video screen recording, like Display Recorder or something like that on the iPad. So there are other ways to get around you don't have to jailbreak your iPad. There's Apple's becoming a little more lenient in allowing certain things on it. But it would be nice to have that choice, and the jailbreak community is very creative and has very smart people. So I suspect at some point they'll figure out a way how to crack the iPad Minis and the iPad 4th generation, and as well as the iPhone 5. So, if that happens, I'll let people know. Now, a few days ago, Apple released a new version of iTunes 11 on a Macintosh. And it's a major redesign, and it's much faster. And it does affect the iPad because, you can, if you want to, sync your iPad either wirelessly or by a connection like the Lightning to USB connection to the iTunes, and to back it up, or to, what settings or what apps you want, you can put in iTunes. And so that interface has changed. So let me to me, I've been playing around with iTunes 11, and I just recently hooked up one of the iPad Minis to it. And the major change is that unless you put it on, Apple doesn't want you to use the sidebar. So if you go to View, Show Sidebar, you can get the traditional old sidebar on the left, and that's where you would see devices, and you would have your iPad. But Apple doesn't really want you to use that in a new interface. Instead, when you plug in your device, you will see, let's say, you will see a little icon up in the top right area that says, when you go to your library, you'll see a little button with an eject button, and it says iPad. And that, if you click on that, it takes you to an interface that's sort of like the old interface where you have summary, info, app, tones, music, movies, TV shows, podcasts, iTunes, But basically the big change is, Apple's trying to get people to not use the sort of sidebar and to have a cleaner interface. And so when you click on that, now you do have up in the left-hand corner this thing that says the name of your iPad mini, and if you click Done after you've synced, it goes back to the interface for iTunes. And there you have buttons on the left, the pop-up window, where you can see your various subsections of iTunes, like music, movies, TV shows, podcasts, iTunes, university, books, apps, tones. And I kind of like it. When you go to TV shows, it looks nicer. When you go to movies, it looks nicer. And anyways, let's just go back to the device settings. So it's pretty much the same. It's just like the icons look a little nicer. Let's see, you can still do info and check for sync contacts, sync calendars, mail accounts, etc. The app interface looks pretty much the same. For file sharing, you still have that sort of sub area where you can get documents in and out of apps. So it's not that different than before for the iPad interface. So the key is, if you're really confused, just go to iTunes View and put on Sidebar if you're not sure how to get to it. But then if you get rid of it, you can see that the way to find it is when it's connected in the top right near where the iTunes Store is. There'll be a button that shows your iPad is connected. And so anyways, it does affect the iPad. I do suggest upgrading to iTunes. I think it runs faster, and is nicer. So check it out. I think it's worth the upgrade. Now, another upgrade you should check out is Apple's Remote App. Apple recently upgraded the Remote App. This is the app that allows you to control iTunes on your Mac or on your Apple TV, and it's updated it to version 3.0. Apple describes the UI revision as the remote is simpler and easier with new ways to browse your library and see and edit upcoming songs with Up Next. A redesigned experience for the iPad shows all songs in an album with the expanded view, and a more powerful search delivers results as you type. So let's see. So it says here, a redesigned experience for the iPad shows all the songs in an album view. So let's see, album view. So I do have this album view now. I guess I didn't have it before, and I'm looking at it, and I'll click on it. Yeah, and so they do this in iTunes too, which is, let's say you have rows of icons, and if you click on an icon, below the row of icons, a new row will pop up with all the information for the album right there with the song. So it's a new UI interface that Apple has created for iTunes on the Mac, and it also is on the iPad, and it's kind of cool. It's a good way, instead of like a pop-up window, it's like this window or a row that slides down, and when you click the icon for the album again, it closes, so it collapses and opens, and it's very slick, and I think it works, and also the row changes color to sort of match the main color theme of the album art. So I'm looking at this album Wilco AM, and so the row is beautiful, like red, and it's actually, the color change I think is very helpful because it makes it easier to sort of see the row as being separate. Now, like I have an album here that doesn't have any album art, and so it just uses a sort of default color. Let's see, I'm going to pick The Doors' Absolutely Live, and that's a very sort of dark background with blue, which comes from the album art. So I kind of like that. I think that works very well. Now, the other feature which is nice in it, and it's also on iTunes on the Mac, is this Up Next feature. And so at the top of your remote app, right where the name of the song that's playing, there's a little icon that looks like some dots with rows, and if you click that, a window comes down, and it's your Up Next window, and it's kind of cool because you can add other music, from your library. You can sort of go through your library and click on something, and it adds it. And if you look in Up Next, that's there, and you can clear the history. You can add something else. I'm going to add. Let's see if that works. Well, let's see. If I click American Beauty, will that go to? Oh, it just goes right to what's up next. So you can just go through and just add a lot of music and create a on the fly playlist, and there it is. Now, if you want to edit it, let's see if I how do I edit it? Maybe while it's playing you can't edit it. But I think that's helpful. And then there's a history button where you can see the history of everything you played in iTunes. But look, this is going to make it easier for people at a party to control iTunes on their main computer. And what's nice about iTunes on the main computer now, I'm not sure if this was there before, but if you play something, you can send it to multiple AirPlay or iTunes, I guess, audio devices. So, for example, I have an iHome device in the kitchen, so I'm going to put that on, and so I have it, and you can control each device separately. But you can add more and more. So I'm going to add, let's see, I got the computer here, and I got so I mean, you could basically create sort of a stereo sound throughout your house by having different Apple TVs, different computers, and different AirPlay devices, and it looks like you can control them. And you can control them through the remote app on the iPad. That's the cool part. You can click multiple and select multiple devices and control it all from your iPad. So it really makes, I think the remote app is fantastic, by the way. It's great for Apple TV. It's great for controlling music and watching video. So I think it's a really good app to update to. So check it out. It's free. Now, one upgrade that I think you have to be careful about is, if the Facebook app, I guess both for the iPad and the iPhone, it's been updated, so it now allows for photo syncing from your iOS app directly to Facebook, so that as you take pictures on your iPad or iPhone, they go right up to Facebook. And frankly, I don't like this, and it's a little creepy because you got to be careful, because if you don't check no when it first sort of pops up at the top of your screen, you might accidentally opt into that. And do you really want all your photos going automatically to Facebook? Dropbox also is an issue. When you connect your iOS device to iTunes, if you have Dropbox on your computer, this window pops up and it says, do you want all your photos to automatically go into your Dropbox? A friend of mine did that, and he discovered that his Dropbox account was saturated, and Dropbox was asking him to purchase more storage, and he didn't know it, but all his photos were being backed up onto Dropbox. And so the thing is, so be careful about that. You might want all your photos to go to Facebook automatically, but I frankly like to pick and choose which photos go to Facebook. I don't want every photo I take. Sometimes I take screenshots of what's on my device, and sometimes I just take bad photos, and I don't want the bad photos, poorly taken to go to Facebook. So that's a feature that I don't like. I don't think you should have automatic upload to these social networks. It's one thing, even with PhotoStream, I like the fact that with Apple's PhotoStream now on the iPad and the iPhone, you can choose like specific people to stream to, as opposed to it's just everything automatically going to photo stream. So anyways, be careful about that if you have Facebook on your iPad or iPhone. Now, the iPad and the iPad Mini are great gaming devices, and one of the things that caught my eye are some of the most traditional old-time games are now on the iPad. Now, who developed the most traditional games? Well, Atari. Remember Atari? They're the ones who had Pong back in the 70s. And I guess it says here, Atari, and to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Pong, has launched the first official Atari Pong game. And the app is called Pong World, and the description here says, Pong World introduces a new generation to the classic game of Pong with a dazzling, unique twist and colorful new look. Explore Pong World by defeating opponents while collecting all 5 paddle creatures, Shaggy, Chompers, Sir Boncelot, Razzle, and Noop. So this is, it's much more involved. The original Pong, if you remember, it was just like a blip going across the screen, and so Atari can't do just a boring blip going across the screen. And it's a free app, but of course there's these in-app purchases. I think it's a free app. Let's take a look at it. But there are, it's a free app, but there's additional Pong coins that you could buy for 99 cents. I frankly don't like that. If you're into the nostalgia, you might want to download it for free. If you're not in like the sort of these games that try to like buy, virtual coins or whatever to succeed better in the games, then don't download it. But I do think it's kind of funny that, one of the first video games is now on the iPad with this virtual Pong or Pong World. So check it out. I've got a link in the show notes to it. Now, if you got an iPad Mini, one thing you should be careful about is ordering smart covers from places other than Apple. And GigaOM has a nice story that came out on November 20th. I did not realize this. I always buy my smart covers from Apple. But they have an article out entitled "Beware of Fake iPad Smart Covers for Sale on Amazon." And this was pointed out first by Frequent Business Traveler. And basically there were some smart covers being sold on Amazon that say specifically that they're made by Apple, when in fact they weren't by Apple. And it said, based on other feedback, some customers seem aware that these are not real Apple smart covers and are fine with it. But they were sort of made to look like they came from Apple, when really they're from a third-party reseller, and they don't necessarily work as well as Apple's smart cover. So if you just bought an iPad Mini and you're looking to save some money by going to Amazon for an Apple smart cover, be very, very careful, because some of them will say things like, buy Apple, but they're not by Apple. So look, I think the safe thing to do is just buy it from Apple. Go to Apple's website. It might be a little pricier, but at least it's the real deal, and that it is going to work well with your iPad Mini. So be careful. Finally, if you have a new iPad Mini or an iPad, be careful. There are people out there stealing them. And in New York City, there's been a rash of thefts of iOS devices, and the police are constantly warning people. And so I came across this interesting article from something called the Leaf Chronicle.com. And apparently in Clarksville, Tennessee, a man used the GPS to track a stolen iPad. So this is a local story in a small town or a small city in Tennessee. And basically this story says, after his bag was stolen from a bar Tuesday, a Nashville man was able to track his stolen belongings with an iPad's global positioning system to Clarksville, where Clarksville police were able to arrest a man Wednesday afternoon suspected of stealing the bag. So what happened was that the victim, I guess, was at a Nashville bar, according to the article, Tuesday night when his book bag containing a watch, iPad, and shaving kit was stolen, according to the police report. And then the victim used, the track your iPhone thing to track his belongings to a residence in Clarksville. And then I guess the police arrived, and they made contact with the guy who was arrested, who was wearing the victim's watch and book bag with the iPad in it. So the guy wasn't too smart. And then a guy inside the house confirmed that the two had been at the same bar in Nashville the night before, and that the other guy, the suspect, had left with the bag. So it was just a straight out theft, and the guy, was released on bail. Hey, so look, the point is, there are people out there stealing stuff. Maybe this guy wasn't targeting the iPad, but a bag. But the point is, people are trying to steal this stuff. So be a little discreet with it. Be aware of your surroundings. Don't, if you feel like you're in some place where somebody can easily snatch it and run with it, don't use it there. So, I'm careful with mine, and be careful with your iPad or iOS device. Well, that's it for episode 114 of the iPad podcast. Thanks for listening. This is a chit-chat-free iPad podcast, and you can help support it by going to iTunes and giving a positive review, or go to YouTube. And so thanks for listening. I'll try to keep this on schedule, but every now and then I may miss a week or two. But, I'm going to stick with it. I'm not going to try to quit. I'm just going to try to stay on with this iPad podcast. So thanks for listening, and see you next time.
This has been a Max Future production.